brought home a treasure trove of Aviation Week. They were throwing them out at his office, and there must have been, I don't know, several years worth. And I read every one of them cover to cover. And in some of the newer ones, this was in the 70s when the Tomcat was under development. And so I was reading, I looked at it and said, that is a cool looking airplane. Boy, is that cool. And and then as a few years later, I found out there was a Marine Corps program that you could sign up and be guaranteed flight school. It was the only one that does it the way they do it. And so in my freshman year, I signed up for this program, and the Marines were in the program at the time. And so about a year into the program, the Marines left the program. So I was already committed at that point. So I got commissioned in the Marine Corps, but then I ended up in the Pentagon because Vietnam had ended, and they had way too many people signed up on this contract. It was called Platoon Leaders Class Air, which gave you a guarantee. So I was going to have to wait about a year. So I ended up in the Pentagon. It's a long story, but in the office were mainly Navy guys and only a couple of Marines, and I was assigned to this Marine colonel. He didn't really have time for me, but one of the Navy guys says, "Hey, we could use him, and we'll get him he wants to fly fighters. We'll get him a flight and a fighter." And they sent me down to Oceana. I got a flight and a Phantom, and the Marine colonel was like, I don't know what his deal was. I never really got to know him at all. But the Navy guy I was working for was a Tomcat pilot, and we'd go to lunch and we'd do stuff, and he goes, you're in the wrong service. You ought to just switch to the Navy so you can fly the Tomcat. And I went, well, how in the world do I do that? He goes, oh, let me make a phone call. So he goes and makes a phone call. He goes, okay, you're in the Navy now. And in those days, this was in 1977, you didn't wear uniforms in the Pentagon. So I wore a blue blazer and khaki pants, and my choice of shirt and tie, and very conservative. And so one day I ended up going to work by then I was a Marine first lieutenant, and I raised my right hand and went home in a blue blazer, and I was a Lieutenant JG in the Navy, and with orders to flight school. And, it was up to me to do well to be able to get the Tomcat, but I graduated number one in my class, and so I got to choose. There was only 2 Tomcat slots, one left. That was my hardest decision because I loved California, but my family was on the East Coast. I wanted to stay close to them. I heard I would be gone a lot. So I picked Oceana, and I saw the movie Final Countdown while I was in flight school. I wanted to be a Jolly Roger, and but I got there, and the Jolly Rogers were about to deploy. They'd already filled up all their slots. So, but I ended up in the transition class with the F-102, and that skipper said, well, I want you in my squadron. So I ended up staying in that squadron for almost 6 years, which is about twice as long as you normally do. But I was senior because I'd spent all this time waiting to come over, and I was already full lieutenant by then. So the skipper said, you ought to do a back-to-back tour and catch up with your peers. So I did. And
wow.
Ended up with 500 traps. I had 1,500 hours, and I had caught up to my peers and then some. And it was just a marvelous experience. We had 3 deployments and 2 North Atlantics. And that today they don't get anywhere near that amount of traps. But it's something I covet. Is my if you need pictures to go with the interview, I have a helmet bag that's got all those patches on it, and I kind of like I was just looking at it a few minutes ago, and because I remember a time when I first got in the community that you see guys with flight jackets and they only had a few patches on it. And so I'm going to wait till I have a full biography to put on my flight jacket. So,
wow, I mean, the career you've got is incredible. First off, from the Marines, then into the Navy, because the F-14 and getting that dream. So, what was your first flight like in the Tomcat?
It was pretty exciting. You know, you do so many simulators that you know how to work the radar. You know, as a RIO, you know how to work the radar, but there's nothing that can compare. And I had a lot of adversary flights before. The office I worked at in the Pentagon knew I wanted to fly fighters, so they had arranged for me to switch services. But they also, right before I went to flight school, they said, we're going to make sure you really want fighters. And they sent me to Lemoore, California, to fly with an adversary squadron for a week. And they were up at Fallon fighting Tomcats. And they, so I would fly 3 times a day. And I called back to the office and said, hey, they're going to be here 2 weeks. Can I stay another week? And I got 25 hours in the A4. None of those flights were more than 1 hour long. So I had a lot of flights. I just really took to it. It took my first aerial photography during that thing with a little Instamatic camera. And the picture kind of holds up. And, you know, I didn't really get into photography with a decent camera until my first squadron, because they assigned me to be the only job left when I joined. I was the last guy in, was to be the public affairs officer. And I said, what's that? And they said, well, you basically take pictures and make sure that we're more famous than our sister squadron. I said, oh, I can do that. And since it was brand new, and I'm also an artist, my degree's in art, so they said, we need you to help us design our markings. So I got to design the markings for our brand new Tomcats that we were just getting in late 1981, and we got the last of them in 82. And I got to design. I was pretty proud of that. And the markings, I designed the Diamondback markings, which has the slash down the side with the diamonds, and that's been really popular throughout the years. So,
well, that, I mean, you know, there are some incredible legends within the community too. I mean, you've got the iconic aircraft, but at the same time, what was those first dogfights like from your perspective in the backseat of an A4 against the F-14?
Well, initially it's hard to pull G and know where to look. And I mean, these guys were really accepted me, and they were like, they weren't just letting me fly back there. They were having me fly the airplane. You know, and I wasn't really sure what I was doing. You know, I just knew I needed to point at the other airplane and pull really hard. But it's a lot that the office is really smart, because a lot of people get into that and don't like it. And they either throw up a lot or, you know, there's, you know, I was always worried about that. I always had the air sickness bag in my G suit, but I never threw up. And, you know, but there was a lot of times I was like, oh, how long is this going to go on? I'm not really sure what's going on, because I couldn't really see in front. And but then, you know, it gets to a point where it's just like playing football or anything like that. It seems like a bunch of chaos, but then all of a sudden you start realizing what's going on. You look, hey, what do I look for? What, you know, you have responsibilities to watch the altitude and the airspeed and watch, you know, look behind you, and you get comfortable doing it, and then it becomes a real sport. The closest thing I can compare it to is football. I've never played rugby, but it might be like that too. I don't know. But it certainly is like, it feels like a contact sport, because when you pull 6 Gs, you are just, you know, that means your arm weighs 6 times what it normally does, you know, and it's really hard to move around and hard to talk, you know, so but you live for it and you look forward to it.
Well, and a lot of those early days too, with the Tomcat community in the late 70s, you've still got a lot of the Vietnam guys who are flying, even some MiG killers within the F-14 community, correct?
My first CO was a MiG killer. And it's funny you say that, because my first deployment in 82, you could tell by the ribbons that all the squadron COs and the air wing commander and the ship all had a lot of Vietnam experience. But then by 1986, there was only one guy in the whole air wing that had seen combat. and only one other guy that had seen a SAM, and that was me, because I had one fired at me off Somalia by accident one day, and everybody else was seeing it for the first time. And then I got to Desert Storm, and I was the only guy in my squadron that had seen combat.
Well, if I may ask, from your perspective, what was that first SAM launch like as a RIO?
Well, it was off Somalia, and we were doing a photo reconnaissance mission. There were 2 Tomcats. We were sent to photograph the beaches because they were going to do an exercise. But I was always trying to get the photo of the month, and I heard that Somalia had Soviet SA-2 missile sites, and I had asked the intel officers to find the location for me so I could sort of sneak over there and take a picture of one. It turned out it was fairly close to the beach. But there were all these trees out there, and I was looking at, there were these really big, wide trees that you see in the Serengeti, and so I realized they're probably bigger than the missile, and it was probably hidden in those. And but I put it in my inertial navigation system, and I put a waypoint on where I thought it was. So I had one of my displays pointing at it. So I was looking out around 10 o'clock for about 10 miles, and I'm looking, and we're the trail Tomcat, and we're just flying at 10,000 feet at max conserve, not a tactical maneuvering speed at all. And all of a sudden, I see this huge plume. It was like a big smoke cloud, like an explosion. And I was like, oh, well, they can't be a SAM. And then all of a sudden, out of this plume comes this flying telephone pole with a big flame behind it. And I'm like, and I just yelled on the radio, break down, because you couldn't turn and break into it like you're supposed to. We didn't have enough airspeed. So, I told the guy I was flying with, split F, and I was going SAM, 10 o'clock. And so both of us did a split F to the deck. So we were flying like 50 feet off the deck and headed out towards the water. And after we got feet wet, we climbed and we looked each other over to see if, is everything okay? And then we hear this voice far away on guard radio, and it says, U.S. Navy aircraft operating near Berbera, come up guard. So we came up, and they said they were an Air Force C-130 crew, and they were sitting on the runway at Berbera, and they saw us come screaming over the harbor, and they said, just so you know, every gun in the harbor was firing at you. We're like, wow, who knew it was in the daytime? You don't see tracers in the daytime. And so then we got up close again and checked each other even better, but we were both unscathed. And by the time we got out to the ship, we were like, did that really happen? But when we landed, they knew all about it because apparently they'd called the embassy to apologize that, they were at sort of this on and off war with Ethiopia, and they saw the 2 jets, and the word hadn't filtered down to the air defense guys, and they thought we were Ethiopian MiG-23s, which I'm like, I have this whole theory about you see what you want to see or you see what you're afraid to see. So I heard that they may have executed the battery commander. There was, all these rumors about that, but I've never heard anything more about it. But I've read so many books that that's exactly what the guys in Vietnam saw when the SAM lifted off. That's exactly what I saw. So,
I mean, and through that, it's got to be a pretty pucker factor experience of seeing that plume of smoke, knowing you got a hot SAM headed your way.
Oh yeah, it definitely got our attention, and it was funny because the TARPS officer, before we went, he said, "Don't worry about the SAMs." So we actually looked over the film, and we found that the lead Tomcat actually caught a picture of it coming off the rail, and we made that the photo of the month, and it was posted in the hallway in the ship, and on the top somebody wrote, "Don't worry about the SAMs," and put that guy's name. His name was Bubba.
Now, speaking of that, did that make you guys pretty famous on that deployment, just for the fact that Sam had been shot your way and you had evaded? What happened with that?
Yeah, it was just sort of, it was just another day in the life, I guess, and you just go on and do what you're supposed to do the next day.
And through that, speaking of deployments, overall, how would you describe your first deployment in 1982?
Well, it was Indian Ocean, and so it was hardly any port calls, over 100 days at sea, which is a long time. So they actually give you every 45 days, you get 2 beers. They have this big Steel Beach thing, and we had 2 beer days during that, and the weather was just gorgeous. But all we did was fly cap up near Iran every day, watching Iran, and so it was like every day was like Groundhog Day. Like, when do I fly? Is it day or night? And you just did it, and then you watched the movie in the ready room. So every day was the same.
Well, and from your perspective as a RIO, when you've got a mission, what's the process through getting in the ready room, going on top of the deck, and then starting up the alignment process in the F-14?
Well, you basically brief about 2 hours prior to the flight, and you walk anywhere from an hour to 45 minutes prior. You have to read the books. You got to get into your flight gear, and then you go up and pre-flight your jet. And they want all the jets turning. They have this lighting system up on the island with little rotating lights. They're yellow, red, and green, and then they tell you it's all just sort of a nice. If the weather is nice and breezy, it's a pleasant day to walk around the flight deck and pre-flight, and not a lot of noise. Just a few huffers and the little yellow vehicles they have that help start the jets if they're not near a battle hatch, and so there's not a lot of noise. It's actually pretty pleasant. You get up on the pre-flight your jet and get up and set up your cockpit. I always go either left to right or right to left. Check all your switches. Same thing for the pilot. You unpin your ejection seat, and plane captain helps you strap in, and then you have your knee board set up with the most important thing is your fuel ladder that you set up in your brief of what kind of fuel you expect to have in 15-minute increments during your flight for your expected landing time. And then when they call away the starts, the air belts will call away, it's now the time to start the engines for the, say, 1400 event, helmets on and buckled, sleeves rolled down, it's a whole litany that he reads off. And so then the RIO closes the canopy, and you yell clear, close the canopy, and then the plane captain starts the air and electricity on the airplane, and it comes to life, and I check the gauges one more time, left to right, and then the pilot starts the engines. The on the top cap, the left engine generator puts a spike to the electrical system, so you don't want to start the alignment until he's got that engine up and running. And so once that happens, you start your alignment, and which is just a flick of a switch, and it takes 7 minutes to get a good alignment so you can take off. But the longer you do it, the better. And then you have a computer address panel, which was cosmic in 1970, but it was pretty archaic by today's standards. The whole Tomcat ran on basically a 64K computer, and they were very artful that whenever they wanted to add something, they had to take something out. But it had the first airborne. This is a story that's just coming out now. It was classified. when they developed it, but they had what's called a Central Air Data Computer, a CADC, and that took all the inputs of, airspeed and temperature, everything, and it decided what the wings should be doing. And it was a microprocessor, but it was as big as a bread box. It was a big black box. It had all these circuit cards in it. But today, that would be like a microprocessor, like your car has, or probably iPhone's probably got it on a chip. But that was a big deal back then. So you wanted to make sure all that stuff works. You ran the ramps, and you checked the onboard. It's called OBC, onboard checks, that ran the ramps, and you made sure that everything worked. And then when they were ready to move, the light started flashing yellow, and they would start positioning the jets for the launch, because normally the jets would be off on the side, and they'd start taxiing you, but you had to take your alignment before you did that. But you wanted to wait till the very last minute on that. And so that's pretty much, the airplane started. It's alive, and it's ready to go flying.
And then from that point, you get clearance, of course, to taxi to the CAT. And what's that catapult launch like?
Well, it's all, all carrier operations are done what called zip lip. So there's no, it's funny, sometimes people ask me or other RIOs or pilots to critique their DCS missions. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, sir.
So in one of them, they were coming to land, and they were calling all the, turning base, turning final, like you would do at an airport, flying a Cessna. And we were like, hey, dudes, we don't talk. Nobody talks, because it gives away the position of the carrier. So the carrier doesn't talk to you. The only time someone would talk would be the air boss uses his big megaphone to tell you to start the engines, and but everything else is all done hand signals through the yellow shirts. And the yellow shirts are assigned to different parts of the deck, and they're the flight deck directors. And so if you're on L3, elevator 3 behind the island, there's a petty officer in yellow that he goes over to your plane captain, he takes charge, and then he directs them to take the chocks off and the chains off the airplane. And he has control, and then he brings you out of the spot that you're parked in. It's called the spot. And then turns you towards the catapult. And then as you get up the catapult, there's another one waiting for you. And then they direct you on to the catapult, all done with hand signals. And then a guy runs up with a weight board and shows it to the RIO. And then I roger with the weight. If the weight isn't right, I tell them to either raise or lower it. And then they set that setting into the catapult. You get us, usually you want about 120 to 150 miles an hour coming off the catapult. Less than 100 miles an hour, the RIO is supposed to eject you. So that's my job as we hurtle down the CAT. 0 to 150 miles an hour in 2 seconds. And I'm staring at this gauge, which lags a little bit to make sure it gets to 100. And that means we're flying. And otherwise, I've got my hand on the lower handle ready to pull it. And so that's a pretty wild ride, the CAT shot. Very wild.
I'm sure it is. Now, in your career, on your deployments and with the various squadrons you were with, did you witness any of the botched CAT shots where RIOs and the crew had to eject?
Not in the Tomcat, but I did see one with a Prowler, and it had a bad CAT shot. Something happened with the shuttle, and they just slowed down halfway down, and they started ejecting. And there's 4 guys in the Prowler, and they all went in the water, but the last guy out, the first guy's ejection seat, when it separated, it went and hit him in the head, and he didn't make it. And I lost a friend at least one a year in different squadrons. And but the only Tomcat mishaps we had was when I was in my department head tour. I just flown aboard the Kennedy, and we were flying the air wing aboard. And my job was to go down to the combat, whatever it's called, CATC, which is the Air Traffic Control Center. So I was down there monitoring everything. They always have reps in the tower or down in CATC at night for Case 3 recoveries, which are like the instrument recoveries. And so I no sooner sat down when one of our guys landed, and he was drifted right, and his wing hit the there was a jet blast effector that was raised, and it sheared off 3 feet of his wing, and the air boss yelled for them to eject, so RIO ejected him. And so I was like, wow, it's really the land of the quick and the dead. Things just happen. So
that they do. I know I've interviewed several pilots, RIOs, and then Air Force F-15 pilots who talk about the loss in the aviation community. It's pretty frequent, and it's something that you just get accustomed to, and it's expected because you're dealing with aviation.
Yeah, I look back on my career, I lost at least one good friend every year. And then I was the editor of Approach magazine, so I got to see it all across the community. As much as we tried to reduce the mishap rate, that's the cost of doing business.
Well, within the naval aviation community, when a friend or a squadron mate is lost, how does the squadron process that? How do you move forward? Do you have a celebration of life? What do you do there?
Yeah, you definitely have a funeral, which is back in those days was before the term celebration of life was in vogue. But you all gather, and it's a funny thing because we talk about this is when somebody is lost, the first thing you want to know is what happened, because you want to know, and I saw this in spades at the safety center, because you want to make sure that there's 3 basic causes that they'll attribute to any mishap. And one is, was it pilot error? And the next one is, was it a material failure? Did something fail on the airplane? And the other one was it maintenance error? Was something done wrong? And they launch an investigation pretty quickly to get to the bottom of that, because they may end up grounding airplanes. And you want to know, because you're like, wow, that guy was really good. How could it happen to him? And how could it happen to me? What do I have to change? What do I have to think about? And so there is there's not just a grieving process. But they want you to, especially we had an airplane coming in single engine because TF-30s weren't all that reliable in the summer of '84, and the airplane started rolling, and they were too low to do anything about it, so they ejected. And that was a big thing about, you got to get them back in the airplane quick. And you do the investigation, but you don't want people to overthink it. It's like getting back on the horse that threw you.
And through that, and with getting people back into the cockpit, getting them back for stick time, is to get their minds off of it, I assume, correct?
Yeah, and get them focused. I mean, sometimes you do safety stand-downs. We had an airplane lost over the side. We had a bad month in July of '84 where they had the one airplane we lost single engine, another one had a ramp strike, and the guys were okay, but the airplane was trashed. And we had another airplane the ship was turning as they broke it down, and the deck was so slick it was like a greasy frying pan. It was middle of cruise. And there was just, you can imagine all the oil and fuel, salt water that gets on the deck, and the non-skid that they normally have on there is worn down. And it's exactly like an iron skillet full of grease. And the airplanes the flight deck director will be telling you to turn right, and the airplane's still going forward with the nose wheel totally cocked 90 degrees. And they were moving this airplane off L3, and the ship hit a rogue wave, which caused it to really heel, and the airplane started sliding. And they had a tow tractor pulling it, but it started pushing the tractor. Then it hit the backside of the wave, then it started sliding backwards. And I was sitting in the airplane next to it watching it, and the wheels were spinning with smoke coming off it. trying to save the airplane. But the airplane went all the way over the side and fell on its belly with the main mounts over the side, and then it started raising up with the tractor still attached. And the pilot was in the cockpit, and he bailed out, and he fell and hurt his head. So he's laying there in a pool of blood, and the airplane just did a backflip up the side.
Jesus.
And it happened so fast, I was like, wow, did I really just see that?
Now,
and
after
so we
that,
did a safety stand down to review procedures and, hey, how could we have prevented that? And, you know.
Now, through that, go ahead, sir.
So whenever that happens, a mishap report that gets filled out gets sent up the chain of command for endorsement, but it eventually gets sent to all the squadrons so that everybody can read them. We have this thing called the message board that has all sorts of message traffic on it that is always sitting in the ready room. You pick it up and you read it to see what's going on. And you always read the mishap reports with great interest to say, hey, what happened?
And then when that's published, I assume that's sent out to all the squadrons in the fleet, not just the squadron that suffered the incident.
Right. They have these message groups. So if it's a Tomcat mishap, they go to all the Tomcat squadrons.
Now, with that being said as well, and factoring in some of the accidents, of course, that take place, and the crew, so what happens to the crews in the accident, those that, of course, survive? Do they go through a period of recovery, hospital checks, then get put back in the saddle, or what's that process?
Well, the first thing they do is report to the flight surgeon, and they draw blood, and they make sure there wasn't anything weird going on. And usually they have, in the mid-'80s, they instituted this process called the Field Naval Aviation Evaluation Board. It's called a FNAB. And I've never had one done to me, but I've sat on them. And it's basically, hey, how you doing? Was this your fault? Because sometimes, we had one guy that crashed that one airplane, and we said, hey, you're going to have to go back ashore. You're not ready for this. And he basically had two FNABs, and second one was, you're not flying anymore. And this is just too much for you. And I was the one that had to tell him. I was on the FNAB, and I said, we could easily go to war next month. And if we do, you're not ready. And we don't have time to make you ready. You have the heart, but you're just all over the map when you try to land at night at the carrier. And it got to the point he was only allowed to fly with me and one other senior RIO. And we both compared notes and say, the guy's too unpredictable. You watch three things when you land. You watch meatball, line up, and go attack. And whichever one was out of parameters, he would focus on that and fix it, but one of the other two would get out of parameters. And it was never the same. And it was scary when I was sitting in CATSI watching him come aboard, and you're looking at the TV screen, and he's like in all four corners of the screen, trying to get on line up, trying to get on, glide slope, and the CAG turned to my skipper, who was there watching. He says, start the paperwork. He's done. And he couldn't get aboard. They had to send him ashore. And so it's a shame. He really wanted to be there, but he just didn't have it, And if it's really bad, if you did something crazy, they can even decide in that board that you're not going to get wear your wings at all, or it's like you continue to fly and wear your wings. One of the other ones is you can fly, but you have to be in the dual piloted airplanes. And that was just some guys.
Yes, sir. Well, and through that, and the military puts the millions of dollars into the training, but you've also got to look out for the safety of other crews on deck.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Now, speaking of some more of your interesting times within the Navy, I know that, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of interesting characters. Did you happen to have any run-ins with a Mr. Hoser Satrapa?
So let me tell you a story. when I was in the Pentagon as a first lieutenant, these guys were telling Hoser stories. And at the time, Hoser was finishing up this big event in Valley Cell at Nellis, and they were monitoring Hoser's progress. And all these guys that had flown in Vietnam were going, well, I got a Hoser story. Everybody had a Hoser story. From fishing, I just had a discussion last night at the Oceana Officers Club. And the two guys were telling Hoser stories. So it started all over again, you know. And the funny thing is most of them are true, like fishing with hand grenades. He really did that, you know. And so I'm finishing the RAG, VF-101, about to report to my squadron. I already know I'm going to VF-102. And they tell me, well, you're going to stay with this other pilot, and you're going to develop the TARP syllabus. And we're bringing in a vigilante pilot and a vigilante, they call them reconnaissance air navigator, RAND. We're bringing in these two guys, and you're going to work with them and set up the syllabus. You're going to be the first two students, but you're going to fly with them and help develop the routes and all that stuff. So the first day I go there, my pilot is Hoser. And I was just like, here he is, larger than life. We were crewed together, and we became good friends. And that guy could fly an airplane I felt like I was in a World War II fighter, even at the 180. I mean, this guy really flew that airplane. And I've had so many people tell me the guy could do things with the airplane that nobody could imagine, you know.
Well,
and they were legends themselves. But in Snort, you know, like the Legend of Legends, he looked up to Hoser. They were really good friends.
Well, it's like even thinking about these legends that do exist. It's like I've always wondered, is this something Hoser was just born with, this innate ability, or is this something that he picked up in his time in Vietnam? Like, well, where did the skill come from?
Well, I can tell you. I can tell you a lot about that because he was at the Naval Academy and he was just like a constrained tiger, and he just wanted to get out of there. His grades aren't that good, and he had a lot of demerits because he was a wild child. But he decided, well, if I can't be the best, I'll be the worst, because at the Naval Academy, the person with the worst grades and the worst composite score, which includes your demerits, is called the anchorman or the goat. And that person gets $1 from every other midshipman. And he was determined he was going to win that prize. And he missed it, I mean, just by a fraction. And it's funny because they actually, I talked to a guy that was on his board to decide whether they were going to let him graduate or not. And they finally just said, well, he really shouldn't graduate, but, you know, it looks like we're going to war in Vietnam. We're going to need guys like this. So let's unleash him on the world. And so after I wrote the book that you have, so you obviously saw the Missing the Ink chapter.
Yes, sir.
So the publisher wanted me to do something on Snort. And I said, well, if you do Snort, you got to do his hero, Hoser. And if you do Hoser, you need to do Bug Roach. So they went, yeah, whatever you want to do. So that's why I did all three of those guys. And I asked a lot of people in the community, other legends, who would you say are the top three guys? And it was, with a rare exception, it was those guys. And so I said, so it's not just me that was so impressed with him. So his widow, right after the book comes out, says, would you like to see his war diaries? And I said, what war diaries? She goes, give me your address. He mailed me his war diaries. He hit the ground running. I mean, I've got his diaries where he's talking about what it's like to be in the PI, waiting for the ship to show up, and how aggressive he was, you know, flying into the break at 500 knots to impress the LSO. I mean, it's just, you know, he was a warrior. He was a born warrior.
Well, and I know in the the book that was written, Hoser Tales, which was a collection of those online stories. A lot of that's mentioned in there. I've been fortunate to read that and talk about it with Magic, and it's always funny that every F-14 guy I've ever encountered, you're right, there is a Hoser story somewhere.
Yeah, that was off my website I created called Tomcat Sunset, and I got Hoser to come on it because people were asking about him, and I got him to come on, and he wasn't sure how to do it, so he would basically email me what he wanted to say, and then I would put it into his. It's a shame that website's not still out there. Facebook everybody started migrating over, and it was really hard to keep the site running after the Tomcat Sunset went away. But that's one of my admins, Andre Johns and Dan Dixon, took all the excerpts off that, and which I think was a marvelous thing to do, to sort of capture Hoser in his own words, which is pretty. Another thing he did, I don't know if you heard this, is once he got to the RAG, when I was crewed with him, he started doing this lecture where he would dress up like Patton, and each new class, he would come in and just do the Patton speech in his own words about what it was like to be in the fighters, and he had this whole slideshow, and that he would show, and it was just people would come from miles around just to sit in on it.
Magic told me that as well, and he said, from the instructor perspective, he said it was hilarious because he's got this, chrome helmet, he's got his baton, and he said he's in there and he's scaring the hell out of these new nuggets to the RAG, and he said, they're all sitting there stiff as a board as Hoser's telling them, is this a good gun kill? And then they're like, yeah. He's like, no, the pepper's not on the pilot, and all this other nonsense, and it was incredible.
Well, did you hear that in his epic engagement with the first engagement between F-14 and F-15 was him, and the picture has the pipper on the pilot's head.
Yes, sir. Magic and I have talked about that a little bit, but I want to hear about that from your perspective. So what's your perspective and thoughts on this infamous kill that sent the Air Force into an uproar?
Well, the Air Force was upset because they were trying to sell the F-15 to the Japanese. They're about to ink the deal. And the AIM ACE-BAL task force that was established at Nellis, Hoser was the officer in charge of the Tomcats. Then there was a contingent of F-15s. And then there were these F-5Es that they would fight. But they were, as part of these scripted, it was called a joint test and evaluation, AIM-BAL, ACE-BAL. AIM was air intercept missile, and ACE was air combat evaluation. And they were trying to determine what's the future of air combat, you've got these high-end fighters, because the people in OSC, if you've ever heard of John Boyd, if you haven't, you need to read books about John Boyd. And when I was the first lieutenant, I was sent on an errand down into the bowels of the Pentagon, and I'm looking at this door, and it says John Boyd. And I'd heard about him because he invented energy maneuverability, and the guy that was the Tomcat guy in my office gave me this manual and says, you need to learn this if you want to fight fighters. And I noticed all the references were John Boyd. And I look on the door, and I asked, and nobody was in the office, so I asked another guy, I said, is that the John Boyd? And he goes, oh, yes, that's him. And so I kept going by there until I finally met him and got to talk to him. And he was of the opinion that F-15 was way too big, way too complex. You needed a really light fighter. To him, the F-5 was the perfect fighter. And when they built it, he used his energy maneuverability to help design the F-16. And he thought that the Air Force ruined it by putting too many avionics and yada, yada, yada. So this whole joint test and evaluation was sponsored out of his office with the other guys of the so-called fighter mafia. And they wanted to prove that your exchange ratio would be so dismal against F-5s with the F-15, F-14, because you basically, because of the Sparrow missile, you ended up with mutually assured destruction, because the F-15 and F-14 would fire Sparrows at beyond visual range, but then as they were timing them out, having to support them with the radar, the F-5 would get close enough to be able to fire a launch and lead Sidewinder, so which is analogous to the latest Soviet ones. So when so they basically killed each other. But with Hoser, he had the top kill ratio, but they were told this is all about fighting the F-5s. You guys better not fight each other. So, but then Hoser and the club met these other F-15 guys that were at the training base. So the F-15 was brand new then. They were training there, and so it finally came to, hey, let's see what you got. So 2 F-14s went out against 2 F-15s, and both the F-14s gunned the F-15s. And so as the word percolated out, 2 weeks later, an Air Force general rolls in and says, where's this guy, Hoser? I want the film. I want everything. And took it away and says, you don't know what you did. You're ruining the sale. And like Hoser really cared. But Hoser had already taken a frame off that and blew it up. You know, it's out there on the internet today. And
well, I mean, even just speaking of that, the fact that you got to have an encounter and know 42nd Boyd is incredible. But two, the double kill on the F-15s, I mean, it's a slap to the Air Force community. And I know a lot of the F-15 drivers, even today, still try to dispute that guns kill, saying that it was actually a fights-off call and it wasn't actually true.
No, that's bull crap. It's true. It's just like an F-15F, a former Tomcat guy, gunned an F-22, and that's out on the internet too.
Yep.
And the Air Force tries to say, oh, it's not a valid gun kill, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, hey, Hoser had the Pipper. Anybody that knows the F-14 HUD knows the Pipper was on, the gun was depressed, and there was zero closure. So he had him dead to rights. And that's the way Hoser fought. And, one thing most of the Tomcat community, at least that I've talked to, we can never understand why is the Air Force so insanely jealous of the Tomcat. We don't disparage them. You're not hearing me disparage them. They basically, and I think part of it is, if you look at a sheet of paper, their numbers are better for thrust to weight and high altitude maneuvering. And yet, just like Rick Tobin said, and Adolf Glahn, they both said things like, it's the spirit of attack. Yeah,
yep.
Born in a brave heart. And Rick Tobin, talked about, fighters need to roam. It's not the man. It's not the machine. It's the man. And and when I can tell you when the Tomcat got the bigger motors, those F-15 guys in Langley were like, it was just amazing when it went out, because they didn't know about it, because they're so impressed with themselves. And I remember the first time I went up against an F-15, and we went up with him, which is a standard tactic that they can out climb you. And we're sitting there right next to him, canopy camping. I'm flying with Flash Gordon. He's going, look, he doesn't even know where we are. He's looking down to see where we went after the pull. And we're right here. And the guy finally turns and looks and sees us. I mean, literally canopy to canopy. And I could see his eyes get big. Like, what the hell are you doing here? And we were able to out climb him and come down on top of him and gun him. And, it really is the man. And, it doesn't matter. Like Oki can tell you he can beat a Tomcat in F-16, but he can also, I was with him when I was so worried about the F-16 with its big motor and its 9G pull. And he goes, no. We're going to go out in an A and we're going to kick his butt. I'll show you. And he did, and he explained it the whole way, making me laugh while he did it. And that's in the book, the picture of the F-14 versus the F-16. That's
yes,
okay. And that really happened. And we described it to Mads, and Mads was able to depict it to Oki's satisfaction.
Well, I mean, it's incredible, too, that, it goes back to the question I asked, are you born with it? And the answer to that is yes. You would agree with that. I've read countless books on World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam, and, of course, with you F-14 drivers. It's an innate ability to fight and win that you guys are born with that made you so successful. And that's where you do have these incredible, gun camera kills that we see of Hoser nailing an F-15, because the only good kill is the guns kill.
Yeah, it's true. And Yeah, I can think about, without naming names, that we had as we worked up to, we got deployed for Desert Shield, and there was a couple guys that just weren't, we were practicing against F-15s, and I was flying with this guy that he just didn't see what was going on, and an F-15 flew right by us, and I said, "Hey, brake right," and I actually talked him into a kill. He never saw the airplane, and I said, "Where were you?" He goes, "Well, I was concentrating on flying for him," and I said, "If we went to war tomorrow, you're not ready." And his answer was, I don't really want to be here. And it was just like, if you think the movie Top Gun, the first one, was fake, I said, "Well, you need to go to the skipper's office and put your wings on his table." And that's what he did. We sent him home that day.
Wow.
He wasn't the only one. And he said, "I didn't sign up for this." And I said, "What? You're in a fighter squadron. What did you sign up for?" He goes, "I just wanted to go to the airlines, and I heard this was the best way. I never wanted to go to war." It's
well,
like, whoa.
Taking a guy like that to war with you, that gets people killed.
Yeah. Or himself.
Yes.
And, we had several of those guys we sent home. And that's not the first time I've heard about it in other squadrons.
No, and I'm sure it's definitely taking place now as well, too, within the fleet in itself.
Yeah.
The people who don't want to be there, they get sent home.
Well, I noticed, during the war on terror, there was that infamous National Guard guy that when they deployed his unit, he goes, "Oh, I'm not going. I didn't sign up for this." And we're like, "Oh, so you're willing to take the money. All you had to do was go in 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year." It's like, hey, that's what you signed up for.
Yep. And through that, it just brings up the point of what's being asked of the fighters crews today, the fighter squadrons. When you're in that position, you're there to do a job. It's not a clean job, but you're there to do a job, and you're there to do it and win.
Well, and I can tell the other factor of this guy was he had a brand new baby, and his wife was so worried about him, and it was really weighing heavy on him. And I asked him, I said, "Do you want to be home with your wife?" I said, "You can be off the ship today." He said, "That's what I want."
Well, and with that, too, I think this first interview was phenomenal, HeyJoe. And for our last question today, and then I'm going to turn off the recording and ask some off-the-record questions. How'd you get your call sign, HeyJoe?
Oh, well, my degree was in art, like I said earlier. And when I got to the RAG, I was already a full lieutenant, and the ops officer said, "Oh, well, we're not going to give you a staff job. The next class is in 4 weeks." And he said, "What's your degree in?" And I said, "Art." He goes, "Hey, well, paint us a painting, for the ready room. And just come back in 4 weeks." I went, "Okay." And I was so proud to get it in Tomcats. I wanted a T-shirt, and they didn't have any. And when I asked them about it, they said, "Oh, no, well, the coffee mess was being, there was the guy they put in charge was stealing. So they basically said, no, we're not going to have any T-shirts." And I said, and he said, "If you want to do one, just bring, we don't want any part of it. You can do whatever you want." And I went, "Okay." So I was basically selling T-shirts out of my car. And one day this RAG instructor, Mountie Mountcastle, comes in, he sees me with this box of T-shirts, and it was like a sale at Nordstrom's because everybody wanted the T-shirts. Because they didn't have any, and I was just trying to make sure I got paid, and I had this, fist full of cash in my hand. And he goes, "Holy cow, it looks like the HeyJoes that followed us back from Naples." And he looks at me, he goes, "Are you Italian?" And then he said, "You, from now on," because at that time my call sign was Sundance, and because I had long hair when I worked in the Pentagon. And so he goes, you're our HeyJoe. And I go, what's a HeyJoe? And it goes, well, it's just a peddler. And I didn't know. And then a year later, I'm in Naples with 2 guys from my squadron walking up the street filled with vendors, and the only English they knew was, hey, Joe, come buy this. They were like wall to wall. And one of the guys with me says, hey, they know you. And they go, hey, your king has returned. And I finally realized what a HeyJoe was. It's someone that says HeyJoe and sells stuff. So it's not because of Jimi Hendrix, even though I like Jimi Hendrix.
Even then, I myself a big Jimi Hendrix fan, but I mean, it's hilarious. I love getting into the call sign aspect of you naval aviators because it is always intriguing no matter what the story is.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Joe.
My call sign now is paw. That's what my grandkids call me. And I don't really like it, but it's just like a call sign. Once somebody gives it to you, you can't shake it.
Yeah, you're stuck with it.
Yeah.
Well, for this first interview, I think this has been brilliant, and I always say this to all my veterans that I interview. Thank you for your service and welcome home.
No, thanks. I do it all over again. I'm sure I'm not the first person to say that.
No, sir, you are not.